Do you have kids that are really obsessed with those blind bag collectors toys that produce a ton of garbage and waste? Well, if you do, today I'm going to show you how you can take the waste from one of those and turn it into some pretty sweet scatter terrain for tabletop gaming. So I have a 5-year-old daughter, and like a lot of 5-year-olds, she's totally obsessed with and into these various toys that are blind bags, and you got to collect the whole set and you never know what you're going to get. And that's fine. I get the appeal of that, but they're really frustrating because they're so often just wrapped up in layers of waste and garbage. Like, listen, I get the appeal of blind bag stuff for kids and surprises, and I get why they're so profitable for these companies, but do they have to wrap them in like 100 layers of waste? Seriously, have you seen an LOL doll? It's the stupidest thing that's ever been invented in terms of packaging. It's like this much toy for this much garbage. It's like the thing of nightmares for anyone who's even remotely concerned about the environment. My daughter's wasteful toys of choice, however, are Hatchimals. They aren't as bad as some, and the toys are decent and the waste is less than others, but one thing they produce are these plastic eggshells that just end up in the trash. For Easter, we got her a pack of these, and I thought, you know, I should probably put the 2 shells aside and try to make something cool with them. And I'm glad I did, because this project, in my eyes, is an absolute winner. I figured I'd throw these on some sort of base and add some goo, and I'd get an instantly cool prop for a dungeon or sci-fi battlefield. For the bases, I just grabbed some MDF circles. These are the kind of thing that you can often find in craft stores. They're great for projects like this. You can get them in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Since I wanted them to have more of a natural beveled edge, I carefully carved down the edges to give them more of a taper. Because the MDF is so soft, it's really easy to safely do this. And while this may look dangerous, it's not, as long as you're practiced and in control of what you're doing, much like a chef peeling a potato or an apple. MDF is also really easy to sand smooth, especially on pieces this small. It doesn't even require an orbital or powered sander. You can quickly do it by hand. I didn't taper the edges completely to nothing, as I still wanted to kind of preserve some of the strength of the edges. To set the shells in place and to give the bases a nice ground texture, I used some Sculptamold. I totally love this stuff for tasks like this. It's pretty cheap, really easy to work with, and it dries really strong and really quickly. Of course, you could use any number of different materials for this step. Joint compound, air dry clay, 2-part epoxy putty, the list goes on. But whatever you have and whatever you prefer to work with is probably fine. Each material is just going to have a different set of pros and cons, but will probably each end up getting the job done. One tip though, when applying things to MDF that you want to bond really well, is that it helps a lot if you lightly wet the MDF first. Well, assuming what you're working with is water-based. This will cause any adhesive to slightly absorb into the wood, making for a much stronger application. I didn't even actually glue the shells in place. I just squished the pieces into the Sculptamold before it was dry, and that was more than enough. Thankfully, I'd also saved a bunch of the broken shell pieces that I could place in front of the opening. But the shells did have 2 issues visually that I needed to deal with. There were some holes on the bases and also a really fine squiggly joint line that ran across the whole shell. You might not be able to see it on camera, but it's very visible in person. I covered the holes with a dab of leftover Sculptamold that still hadn't dried and decided to create kind of like an umbilical cord type thing that would come out of the end. And that way I could drape those over the shell and also cover the seams. I thought about using something like green stuff or milliput for this, but since the great toilet paper craze of 2020 seems to have died down, at least in my neck of the woods, I could return to using it as a crafting material. So using one square and some very watered down PVA glue, I twisted up a cord and and draped it over the shell. This is a really easy way to make something like this that doesn't take too long to dry and doesn't use any expensive material. I thought the insides of the shells still looked too empty though, and they had sort of a factory produced pattern that didn't quite look right. So an easy fix was again to use some more watered down toilet paper and glue to just kind of stuff inside and create a bit of an organic texture. More Sculptamold would also have worked just fine, but I didn't feel like mixing up a new batch. I was thinking it would be really neat though if these umbilical cords had some tiny vein-like tendrils coming off of them. So to do this, I turned to lichen, just the stuff that you see in bags at basically every craft store. It's a bit of a pain, but if you break apart and grab really tiny small strands of this, you can create some great looking effects. The important thing is to make sure that they are really saturated in super glue and completely attached to your piece. If any bits are just sticking up, well, they're almost certainly going to break off at some point, and probably some point soon. For the painting, I decided to prime these out white, thinking, that would be the best starting point for painting eggs. For some reason, I chose to prime with a rattle can, which was actually a bit of a mistake in this case. These pieces have a lot of little nooks and crannies and undersides that were really hard to get to with the spray can. It just sprays out with too much force and you don't have much control over it, so getting in those little hard to reach spots creates a big risk of overspraying everything else as you apply too much. I really wasn't happy with the spray job, so I let it dry and reprimed it again with VALLEJO primer through my airbrush. The airbrush allows for a lot more delicate control and makes it easier to get into the hard to reach spots. This time though, I switched gears and sprayed it out black first. That way I could zenithal highlight everything with gray, followed by white, and this would allow me to get a nice paint job on these with minimal effort by using transparent inks. I first sprayed out everything with a very vibrant green ink. This created a very nice look over that zenithal priming. Then using a darker brownish green, I started spraying in some shadows in the appropriate areas. This was really the perfect project to practice my still pretty rudimentary airbrush skills on, so I really took advantage of that opportunity. But this was the point where things started to go south. I liked the way things were looking, but I wanted to give those umbilical cords more of a fleshy look. I thought contrast paints would be perfect for this, and I first brushed on a purple one, and while it looked okay, it didn't really look quite right, so I decided to do another coat of red contrast paint. This, well, kind of looked okay on the cord itself, but I really wasn't careful enough with the application, and so it kind of bled onto the egg in a way that kind of looked sloppy and not right. So experimenting with the airbrush further, I applied some burnt sienna ink. The idea here was to mute the red a little bit and kind of feather out that contrast bleed. It sort of worked, but much like a quarantine haircut, it just kept going a little further and a little further until the whole thing was a disaster. I really was not happy with the paint job at all anymore. And often I will continue down a path just to go with it and see it through. But I really liked this build and I wanted to do the paint job right. And I still wanted to practice my airbrush skills, so I decided to try and pivot and fix it. I went back in with a white primer and tried to only paint out the shell, leaving the cord. This was a great situation to practice more detailed and controlled airbrushing. I let the dark shadows that were already established show through the white and didn't worry about the kind of speckled application of the primer, as it was actually looking kind of right for an eggshell. This decision was one of the best that I made on the whole project, as it was a crucial step to actually getting these to look the way I wanted. For the most part, I was able to stay in the lines, so to speak, spraying on the white, but there was of course some overspray on the cords. This was an easy fix though, just a bit of sepia ink carefully brushed on to cover those oversprayed areas. The overspray on the bases was corrected in the exact same fashion, but using some Egg Wax Earthshade. I was pretty happy at this point and wanted to finish them off with some nice slimy effects. I figured some glossy contrast between the cords and the shell would be great, so I brushed on some VALLEJO water effects to give them a really wet look. Gloss varnish or Mod Podge or anything like that really would have worked just as well, but I already had the water effects out as I was about to use them on the following step. For the weird alien goo, I used the water effects mixed with the most vibrant neon green ink that I had on hand. I just poured the stuff right in, sloshed it around, and let it run wild. I should point out though that after I let this stuff dry, I had lost a fair bit of it due to shrinking as well as running off the piece as it dried. So off camera, I did do a second application in the exact same fashion. What's really neat about using this sort of vibrant ink though is that if you shut off the lights and put a black light on it, they light up like crazy in a really cool effect that you could actually consider implementing during an in-person game. To give the goo one more bit of oomph, I created some drips. For this, I switched to UV resin because it could set up and harden instantly. The same thing could be done with the water effects from earlier, but you have to wait quite a while for it to dry. With the resin, you can draw out the lines, set them with UV light, and apply them right away using more resin as the adhesive. One interesting thing though is that the ink didn't want to mix into the resin properly, which is interesting. I've used other inks and paints with the resin in the past and they mixed fine, but this one wanted to separate. And I was actually kind of happy that it did because it gave it a really interesting kind of speckled, oily look that I thought was just a straight up bonus. This is the part of the video where I usually try to say something encouraging about how the project wasn't perfect, but that's okay, or that it didn't go as I had planned, but that doesn't matter. But in all honesty, I can't say that here. In my mind, I love every single thing about the way this build turned out. I think they are straight up hella cool. I'm proud of my paint job on them, and I'm proud of the way that I used the leftover trash from a silly toy to make them. My only regret is that I haven't been saving these shells all along and only had 2 to work with. Imagine a skirmish game where the whole table is littered with these things. I think that would be absolutely amazing. So what do you guys think? Personally, I think this project is one of those golden type elusive perfect projects for terrain builders that we're all after. And what I mean by that is that they're so universally useful in different settings. They would look right at home in the depths of a dungeon or cave in a fantasy game setting like Dungeons and Dragons. And they would look equally as appropriate in the hull of some abandoned spacecraft in a sci-fi RPG, or they would look great on the table of some sort of skirmish war game. Like really, you get a lot of mileage out of these eggs, even though they are in a way very specific. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. What do you guys think? I hope that you enjoyed this video, found it entertaining, useful, helpful. If you did, hit the like button and let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. Do you have any toys that your kids are obsessed with that produce some sort of similar trash that maybe could be repurposed in a creative way? Let me know, and I'm gonna look into those as well. If I can steer my kid into liking things that create usable garbage, I'm gonna do so. If you wanna pick up any tools or supplies for your own hobby needs, maybe something like Sculptamold or UV resin or a black light flashlight, head over to blackmagicraft.ca. There I have my essential equipment page where I link all of the stuff that I use regularly so you can make sure you're getting the right thing and have it shipped conveniently to your door. Also, if you enjoy these videos that I make each and every week, if you truly get some tangible value out of them, if they improve your life, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. That support is really crucial to allowing me to make them every week, and I'd love to have you as the newest member of the Black Magic Craft Fellowship. That's it for this week, guys. I will see you again next week. Cheers.